Welcome to the panelists, welcome to the public. This is a joint initiative from the MAison Française d'Oxford and the European Studies Center of St. Antony's College. We all know that we live a very, very peculiar and dramatic period for both the EU and the world. We had not planned this, but we are in the middle of a huge crisis. And we wanted to take advantage of the French presidency of the EU to organize this event, this workshop. We'll have two panels. The first one will deal with the state of the EU, and the second one will focus more on the French presidency and the EU. We'll have 3 panelists in the first panel and 4 in the second one. So I will ask the panelists to really keep with the 15 minutes which were planned. So each panelist will present his paper, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers after the first panel and after the second panel. Hartmut, I give you the floor right now, not to lose time.
Thank you, Yves, and I'm delighted to, as the director of the European Studies Center, to have this cooperation for this particular event. We have had wonderful relations over many, many decades, and this is a good occasion to cooperate again. I'm delighted to see old friends, colleagues, people who have been associated with both institutions, people who have studied with us, and it's a delight. The circumstances when we planned it, as Yves said, were different, and we live in a slightly different world. So when we talk about the state of the Union, it is not only going through the 10 priorities that any presidency would have identified. We need to see this in the larger context. And I'm delighted to share this panel with 3 panelists. There's Samuel Faure, who is an associate professor in Paris and researcher at CNRS, who specializes in European defense, security, and so on. And unfortunately, it could be more topical to probably start with considerations about European defense in the current context. And then there is Calypso Nicolaides, who's a professor at the European University Institute for a long time in Oxford, the most prominent scholar on EU relations in Oxford, but ranging further into IPE, questions of democracy, political theory, post-colonialism, comparative regionalism, a decentered perspective on European affairs. I'm delighted, Calypso, that you join us. And we have Eli Gateva, who is an expert on European affairs, but also on Europe in the world. I hope she will join us later, but I think if she does, I don't introduce her again. She will just join us. I have the pleasure to give Samuel the floor to open the debate on the future of the European project. Samuel.
Thank you very much, Hartmut. Good afternoon, all. A pleasure to be with you this afternoon. So the dominant argument in EU's foreign and defense policy the last few years is that of an awakening of the European Union. This awakening is embodied in President von der Leyen's idea of a geopolitical commission, President Macron's European sovereignty, the notion of strategic autonomy, and the spirit of the strategic compass. It's, in other words, the passage from inward narratives to outward narratives of Europe. And to listen to a certain number of experts and journalists, this awakening would have happened all of a sudden, according to the expression repeated in a daily basis. European defense have advanced more in 2 days than in 20 years. And many people actually say the same thing. Not so long ago, in the context of Brexit, European defense have made more progress in 2 years than in 20 years. I'm going to try to explain why I do not agree with this analysis, or only partially. First, I'm going to recall the constitutive elements of this institutional and political revival that took place from 2016, 2017, with the strong impulse, actually, leadership from France. Then I'm going to develop the rather counterintuitive idea that it's highly unlikely, from my opinion, that this institutional and political revival will translate into strategic and military changes in the short term, despite actually the decisions of the last 2 weeks. And after having carefully read this morning the draft declaration of the European Council, as you know, there is today and tomorrow an informal European summit in Versailles. So first, the institutional and political revival. Yes, indeed, there have been an important institutional relaunch of European defense in the context of Brexit, the Trump administration, and following the annexion of Crimea by Russia in 2014. I'd like to briefly list the main initiatives that have been taken since 2016. Within the European Union, there have been first the creation of the European Defence Fund, EDF, and the activation of the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, in 2018. Second, the integration of industrial defense issues in the portfolio of a commissioner, actually the French one, Thierry Breton, who heads DG Défi since 2019, which is the first time actually for Thierry Breton, but for the industrial defense issues, for the first time in the history of the Commission, the European Commission. Third, the strategic compass, which is a kind of white paper on defense issues for the European Union, is to be presented normally in a few weeks. This is only the third time for a text like that to be published after the European security strategy in 2003 and the EU global strategy in 2016. Initiatives have also been taken outside the European Union. First, the launch in 2018 of the European Intervention Initiative on the proposal of President Macron during and after his speech at La Sorbonne in September 2017, and which brings now together 13 states, European states, including non-EU member states like Norway and Britain. Second, the Takuba Task Force, an ad hoc arrangement that brings together 8 European states. This task force aimed to support the French military operation Barkhane in the Sahel, which itself aims to support the G5 Sahel against jihadist terrorist groups in this transnational region. Third, the creation of the European Peace Facility, EPF, in 2021, which is an extra budgetary instrument that aims to improve the European Union's capacity to prevent conflicts, consolidate peace, and threaten international security by allowing the financing of operational actions under the common foreign and security policy that have military and defense implications. It's these instruments that have enabled the delivery of equipment and supplies to the Ukrainian armed forces, included for the first time lethal equipment. There are also bilateral and minilateral initiatives that have been taken in recent years. First, the Aix-la-Chapelle Treaty was signed between France and Germany in 2019. Second, the Quirinal Treaty between France and Italy just a few months ago in November 2021. Third, 3 major European cooperative arms programs have moved forward, which was not easy. The future tank, MGCS, between France and Germany, the future combat aircraft named SCAF, between France, Germany, and Spain, and the Eurodrone named Airpass between France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. To sum up, instruments have been created inside the European Union and outside the European Union, some in a bilateral format and others in multilateral and minilateral configurations. The field of defense, in other words, and foreign policy thus embodies the dynamics of differentiated European integration, or what I call a flexilateral defense policy in Europe. So with these big pictures in mind, let's move on to part 2 of my presentation with this question. But why then should this institutional and political revival not translate into a reinforced, stronger integration of national defense policy, and so lead to a European, stronger European strategic culture? Because all of these European instruments are built on the same model of intergovernmental governance, which, with one exception, the European Defence Fund. The changes at work are more, in a way, parametric than paradigmatic. Peter Hall had taught us that there are 3 orders of political change: uses or practices, instruments, and objectives. There have been changes in practices, the activation of PESCO, for example, and in instruments, the creation of the European Defence Fund, but not in objectives, really. There has been no structural change in this institutional architecture of European defense. For example, even today in 2022, the Council of Defense Ministers is informal, and decision-making is by unanimity and not by qualified majority votes. I'd also point out on the industrial side that there has not been the constitution of a single European champion of defense on the model of MBDA or Airbus in recent years. For example, bargainings are not progressing for the integration, of the Franco-German consortium KNDS in the land domain after the joint venture that dates back to December 2015. Actually, and unfortunately, I make the same reading of the draft Versailles Declaration that was published in the press yesterday and this morning, while the heads of state and government are getting together today and tomorrow for an informal European summit in Versailles. The main initiative seems to be the creation of a fund, like the Recovery Fund decided in the summer of 2020 during the COVID-19 crisis. This fund could have 200 billion euros, so it's huge. But if tomorrow this investment fund is confirmed as the main initiative taken by the European Council, 4 remarks could be made. One, the European Council will have chosen a financial instrument rather or also than an institutional one. No initiative on governance, as I've already mentioned. 2, the European Council will have preferred an ad hoc instrument rather than a budgetary institutionalization. It seems a bit paradoxical, to say the least, not to have increased the multi-annual budget 2021-2027 of the European Union, voted by the Council and the European Parliament only a few months ago, and still corresponding to 1% of the GDP of the 27, So a kind of status quo on that one. And then to propose, due to this terrible situation, a 200 billion fund today, again to be confirmed tomorrow. This is one more time a policy of exception. And this political practice that we do know also at the national level, especially in France, doesn't mix well with a more assumed, a more lively democracy, less delegated to the executive powers, in this case, the European Council. There are long and difficult debates during the vote on the multi-annual budgets, but this is not the case for this type of fund voted because it's necessary as soon as possible. In fact, the European Parliament and the national assemblies are not invited to express their views, or only after the fact. It seems quite difficult one more time to articulate sovereignty and European sovereignty and democracy. For a policy instrument doesn't produce the same effects according to the uses to which it's put. However, in the text finalized by the heads of state and government, so the General Secretary of the Council, we will also expect details on the incentives, more or less 200 billion, but also the counterparts for the state and their private companies. Another example, giving more money to Dassault Aviation will not help the integration of European defense. In conclusion, I've tried to demonstrate really briefly that we are witnessing an institutional and political relaunch of European defense indeed since 2016, which paradoxically shouldn't be a structural game changer, should not lead to military and strategic transformation, at least in a short-term perspective, because these changes relate to the uses and instruments and not the objectives of these policies. We do remain in the intergovernmental order, governance of European defense, and nothing seems to challenge it for the moment. In this, President Macron is developing a European practice and policy that, in a way, at least for strategic and military issues, is much closer to Jean-Pierre Chevènement than François Mitterrand. On Tuesday evening, last Tuesday, the French Secretary of State for European Affairs, Clément Beaune, evoked during a conference organized by Le Grand Continent the assumption of a Washingtonian moment after the Hamiltonian moment of the summer of 2020. We are not there yet, and obviously now I'm curious to know what you think about it, and if the European Council proved me wrong during its conclusions presented tomorrow at the end of the day. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Samir, for this excellent opening, wide-ranging, measured in terms of not reacting to panic events that we're all reacting in these days, but putting the events of today into a larger context, both in terms of development of European defense capacities, in terms of a strategic culture, but also how this situates with questions of democracy, legitimacy, Europeanization, and so on, while at the same time drawing our attention to Versailles. And we might have, historians might write from Versailles to Versailles and saying maybe this was the 100 years of institutionalism and the return to something different in the long run. But I leave that to people who are much, much more qualified to speculate about that. But I think we are living in a moment which will signify fundamental change in European and global affairs. Calypso.
Hello, everyone. My wonderful colleagues in Oxford asked me if I would say a word about the Conference on the Future of Europe, as Hartmut said way before all of this happened. And like Samuel, you know, how we of course, we're all speaking today in the shadow of the war and of this Kiev moment. I mean, we're talking about a Washingtonian moment. We are in the Kiev moment. And the Conference on the Future of Europe was about the good old thing, bringing the citizens closer to Europe, entrenching European democracy is about that. And so the first thing I'd like to say is, you know, what is the link? Is the conference kind of in a way a sideshow now, or on the contrary? And first of all, I think we should recognize that above all in this war, it's democracy that's at stake. There can be a big debate about the motivation of Russia there and NATO encirclement, yes. But I think a lot of the insiders who nobody understands Putin's mind, but you know something about how he's reasoning, is the fear of a functioning liberal democracy at its border, the field of contagion effect, the fear of contagion effect, etc., is probably the biggest factor that moves him. Maidan was the moment that led to Crimea, 2015. So to a great extent, it's the claim for democracy at its door that threatens Russia. But of course, unlike the last convention, the precedent for the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is of course 2001, 2003, where we had an Iraq war, I mean, the situation was the reverse, obviously, because we had a liberal interventionist intervention that was supposedly meant to deal with something called nuclear weapons, but also a broader neocon vision of exporting democracy, whereas in this case, we have liberal democratic restraint against an autocratic intervention against democracy. And so part of the challenge for us is to ask, well, you know, how do we, if we're no longer in the game of coercive, either protection or promotion of democracy, you know, how do we do it? And of course, we do it in all the ways that we know, and Samuel was also describing, although they're not that relevant for the moment, but sanctions and all the rest of it. Now, but the question for us European is, I would summarize with these words, democratic resilience. Can we demonstrate our democratic resilience of ourselves and in our neighborhood? On one hand, the democratic anchoring and therefore ownership of our foreign policies. In fact, Sam said it just now, you know, to what extent are the decisions made democratically, institutionally, but also in terms of the publics. But more broadly, what is this EU that is claiming, you know, the moral high ground in this story? How democratic is it? And how democratic is it making itself? And there, you know, we have two kinds of competitions in the world. We have the competition, of course, the kind of Schmittian competition between autocrats and democrats. And can we show that, in fact, democracies are better at caring about the long term, about sustainability than often even our young people believe, that some, you know, how half of young Europeans believe autocracies are more efficient in dealing with, say, climate change or other. And we have to demonstrate, no, democracy can do it better. There's another sub-competition, which are in a way with the US approach, the very same weekend where we in Florence welcome a European citizens panel in December. Alienor is nodding because she was there. There was, of course, the American Summit for Democracy. Very different approaches. Because there it was all about who is labeled as a democracy and who's not, and very strange bedfellows. In our case, it was a much more low-key, nobody talked about it, but much more low-key, but I would argue a much deeper process, and I'll say a word about that and what I think it is promising. But let me add to this moment, this Kiev moment, to say that I do think that for better or worse, those who are leading this Conference on the Future of Europe, which started less than a year ago and is due to finish on the 9th of May, are inviting, in fact, their host, one of the three co-presidents, is inviting a delegation from the Ukraine tomorrow to the next plenary of the conference, which has another 3, to speak and connect the conference with the tragic events in Ukraine. And in doing so, himself and others are now changing the narrative. That is saying, this war demonstrates how ambitious we need to be and institutionalize this ambition. So yes, there are all these dramatic incremental changes, ad hoc changes that Samuel was talking about. But no, we have this instrument, as it so happens. We have a conference that is meant to explore how we're going to adapt Europe to the great challenges that we're facing, no bigger than this one. And so in the last few days, what you hear, the buzz in the conference, is that this idea of a constitutional convention, repeating what happened 20 years ago, minus all the mistakes that were made that led to the French and Dutch no, that now is about treaty change, maybe a constitutional. In any case, it is about grasping the Kiev moment to multiply the ambition of the conference on the future of Europe. And note and remember that last time with Iraq, it was the opposite, because obviously Iraq divided Europeans very deeply. And now we see quite a big unity. And I don't think it's one unité de façade. I'm usually pretty cynical about these things, but I do feel that there is a spirit of unity. I mean, it was fascinating to see the visits in Warsaw that when mentioning the rule of law was with a smile. Now we can come back to this and how sustainable it is. I would love a discussion on this, but that's the whole kind of like vibes and questions of the Kiev moment and how it overlaps with the conference on the future of Europe. Now, Hartmut, if you allow me, and if I have a few more minutes, I'll say a bit more specifically then about where we are with this conference. I think as everyone listening in more or less knows, the conference has been organized around 3 big innovations. This digital platform, the Citizens Assembly, 800 citizens divided in 4 topics, which cover absolutely everything under the sun. And then now, and those 4 have finished 2 weeks ago. And now we are only with the plenaries. The plenaries, which started earlier, but are bringing together the citizens' recommendations, the digital platform recommendation, what all the national and European parliamentarians think, the Commission and the member states. It's a huge, big mess and a complicated one. But why is it an innovation? Because these plenaries that we're seeing now have been asked to really seriously take into account the recommendations of these citizens, which themselves were supposed to take into account the digital platform. They didn't very much, but whatever. Now that is fascinating because in terms of the Citizens Assembly, and Yves is here, who knows much more and can speak to this issue brilliantly. But I think it's fair to say that while there's been 1,500 Citizens Assembly in the last 20 years around the world at the local national level, we haven't had transnational ones. And there is one starting under COP26, but this is a big first. And I have, having watched it very closely, found the process fascinating. It really makes the idea that the EU is an experiment come to life, because this is an experiment within an experiment within an experiment. These assemblies are experimental, transnational, translation in 24 languages, bringing all these people together. Within a conference that's also an experiment within the EU, which is an experiment writ large, as those of us like to say to our students. And experiments are trial and error. And so indeed, these transnational panels have, I think, been a great promise, including because one of them, the one on democracy that met in Florence, has itself looked at itself in the mirror. And its very last recommendation, number 39, which was initially called number 42, just like in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that is the answer to the question of democracy. Just a joke. In any case, recommendation 39 is about Citizens Assembly. It's about these citizens saying, hey guys, we've done this now for 3 months. We see all the other citizens in the other 3 citizen assembly doing it. This is super cool. It has its problems. It takes us away from home, etc. We have many frustrations, but make it permanent in Europe. Reinvent representative democracy to have alongside participatory deliberative democracy. At least they've recommended that. And that is full of promise because it can't be ignored. Now, and I think this is important. And we also have, we have about 180 recommendations from these 4 citizens panel. Now, here's a challenge. You've got this plenary, and they've got to, initially, I think it's fair to say that most of the participants, parliamentarians, politicians thought, well, it'll be interesting. We'll have a list of inputs from the citizens, and we can say we listen to the citizens. But there's been a lot of pushback, especially from the 80 ambassadors from the 4 citizen assembly. There's been pushback from some national parliamentarians, some European parliamentarians, from civil societies around it, etc. Not the big public out there who still doesn't really know about the Conference on the Future of Europe. But this pushback says, look, you have to take these recommendations seriously. Either you use them or you explain why you don't. And of course, what we do know is that some recommendations can be implemented by using the EU legislative and budgetary capacity, including, as Samuel said, the budget that was just passed. Others really require a different ethos. I mean, it doesn't even require new capacity, just it's a mindset. And others will require treaty change, like making a permanent citizens assembly, like issues about voting, et cetera, and in the climate change recommendations, some issues that have to do with taxation, et cetera, must also require treaty change. So there's a lot of study and a lot of thinking about what in all this requires treaty change. But what matters now is to watch the extent to which the last moment, the next 2 months of this conference can transformer l'essai, can actually make être à la hauteur, can make good on what has happened until now. The frustrations when we can come back to the flaws and problems, but also the idea that there are these recommendations, that they're very ambitious for the EU, including on Europe and the world. We can come back to this. And that, the parliament has a report now. It says, well, most of this we've already done, or we have ways to do it, or we have a committee that does it already. But I don't think that's the way in which to really engage with the recommendations. They're not always cast, they're never cast really in technocratic ways, but they're the promise of the future for the conference. And I just want to add, Hartmut, end on the French presidency, because this is our theme. And of course, the French presidency initially was actually the mover, and Macron was the mover behind this conference. Then it kind of retreated a bit because it's so that it wasn't very present or enthusing, people. But, and of course, you could say that now its heart and energy is on the war, and who cares about the Conference on the Future of Europe. But as I started us with, I think it's a moment that the French presidency can and probably will grab to exactly translate institutionally the kind of sense that we are back in movement, that crisis is what makes EU happen, that we've had some really bad crisis of slow reactiveness and in fact counterproductive reactiveness, especially the Euro crisis, but that now we will make something else out of the crisis, the Ukraine crisis, and the COFI would be the perfect vehicle. So I expect to see that, or at least I hope to see that. And well, let's see what happens. Happy to say more, Hartmut, in the Q&A.
Thank you, Calypso. And I welcome Ellie, who had some technical issues, but we are glad you are here with us now. You have had some disadvantage in not having a chance to listen to the full presentations. One was more focused on defense and security, capacity building, institutions, and so on. And one focused more on the specific Conference on the Future of Europe, all within the context that we all know that hit us a few weeks ago, that might or might not change everything we wanted to say about the state of Europe. Ellie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hartmut. I'm very sorry. This was an epic struggle with Zoom, but I'm happy that I'm finally able to join you, and I'm sorry that I've missed the beginning of the presentations. So I will try to share my screen because I have prepared a presentation. Right, I cannot share the screen, it seems. So that's perfectly fine. So it's okay. I had some slides with pictures. What I wanted to do, because we obviously talked about this discussion before what is now happening in Ukraine. So I had a completely different presentation in mind to talk about some of the recent developments, and I still intend to do that. But I was very much tempted to give a broader historical perspective and to think about EU's role in terms of promoting democracy and strengthening democracy, and how it has been very much intricately linked to EU enlargement policy. And I mean, again, enlargement policy is very much back on the agenda. I would argue perhaps not for the best reasons, but I think it still very much pushes us to rethink the very nature of the process of European integration, the direction in which European integration is going to go forward in the future, and also very importantly, what the EU should and should not be doing. The first thing that I want to do now is just briefly have a recap of some of the key historical developments that have shaped EU democracy promotion and strengthening of rule of law and democracy outside and inside the European Union. And then I will take stock of some of the more recent developments, and I will try to end on a positive note. So forwards looking and positive and cautiously optimistic about the future of European integration and strengthening democracy inside the European Union, but also in the Western Balkans. So I think, I mean, it's impossible not to draw parallels given what is happening right now to some of the early decisions that kickstarted the process of the Eastern enlargement and the Eastern expansion. I was thinking about the Copenhagen summit back in 1993, when finally, 4 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the then EU leaders decided to give the green light to expansion with the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, and also provided the membership criteria, which also includes the Copenhagen political criteria with a focus on democracy, the rule of law, rights of minorities, protection of human rights. So this is very much the first point at which the EU institutionalized and put democracy at the heart of EU enlargement policy. And for a very long time, democracy promotion was very much confined to Central and Eastern Europe. And obviously it was enlargement policy that also shaped the establishment of the European neighborhood policy, under which the EU was willing to offer anything but institutions to countries in the Eastern, but also in the Southern neighborhood. And very much at the beginning, the promotion of the Copenhagen criteria and the rule of law and the way that the EU has thought about spelling out how it's about to conceptualize and measure democracy was with a very firm focus on the countries from Central and Eastern Europe. And it has been very interesting to see that in addition to democratic formal institutions and constitutions, we have seen also a very strong and keen focus on incorporating fight against corruption informally in the evaluation of this process. And then it was in 2000 when we had the fairer European Council in Portugal that officially membership perspective was extended to the countries from the Western Balkans, again, after a very traumatic development that took place in Kosovo after what was happening there in 1999. It was in 2000 that the EU decided to use its soft power and take action in promising the countries from the Western Balkans that they were granted what was back then the membership perspective and has now become European perspective, to be formally endorsed in the Thessaloniki Declaration in 2003. So we had the signing of the accession treaties with the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, but also a very strong message of extending European membership has been sent to the Western Balkans. And it's been almost 30 years since the Copenhagen criteria and 20 years since the Thessaloniki Declaration. And what we have seen as a result of that is that 10 countries from Central and Eastern Europe have become members and joined the European Union, and the process with the countries from the Western Balkans for almost 2 decades has not significantly advanced. We have seen Croatia become a member state in 2013, but since then, one of the key conventional wisdoms about the transformative power of Europe has been significantly challenged. So even though we perceive the EU to be a driving force for democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, the expectations, or more probably there has been disappointment that this has not happened at the same speed or to the same level in the Western Balkans. And this has posed important questions about whether we should compare Central and Eastern Europe to the Western Balkans and to what extent these comparisons are fair. And I think the level and scale of complexity of the challenges that the countries have faced from Central and Eastern Europe has become, it's definitely much more challenging compared to the early developments in Central and Eastern Europe back in the 90s. But also very importantly, the EU has sent a completely different signal in terms of credibility and commitment. And for some of my slides I have 2 quotes. One was from Verheugen and one was from Barroso, essentially urging Europeans to deliver on the promise and highlighting this as a historical opportunity to reunite the continent. And I think the other key historical point that has very much changed the narrative and the discussion about enlargement, but also about democracy, has been the referendum on the Constitution of Europe, which happened in 2005. The shock and surprise no in France and nay in the Netherlands has very much turned the tide against EU enlargement and EU's members' support for further enlargement. So since then, basically, there has been a very much more cooler approach to enhancing and promoting a speedy reunification with this part of the European continent. And we have reached another level. It was in 2014 when Jean-Claude Juncker became the president of the European Commission. He very much noted that no enlargement will take place in the next 5 years. So in contrast to having timetables, a lot of enthusiasm, and a very strong and hard work to enhance the process of European integration, we have seen exactly the opposite. For the first time, Commissioner for the President of the European Commission highlighting the fact that there will be no further enlargement in the next 5 years. So while not only we have questioned the EU transformative power in the Western Balkans, we have also seen that the EU can have a negative impact on developments of the quality of democracy. So there is plenty of research highlighting the impact that the EU has not only legitimized autocratic leaders in the Western Balkans, but it has also very much provided more money for autocratic leaders in Central and Eastern Europe and helped them consolidate their power. So I think one thing that we should very much be it's a good thing to consider that the EU has an impact. So the question is, it's not only having a positive impact, it can have a negative impact as well. And as a result of that, I think that specifically over the last 10 years, a number of important lessons have been learned. And the first and the most important one, when it comes to promoting and strengthening democracy, is that accession does not mark point of no return. So again, this has been one of the perceived wisdoms that once that you become a member, there is no turning back. Clearly, we can see that this is no longer the case, and important, very unfortunate developments have been taking place, most prominently in Hungary, but also in Poland, but other countries as well. I would like to say that this is not specifically an Eastern European problem, and we should be very much aware of that. And this posed a significant problem for the EU because the Copenhagen criteria was there to drive EU enlargement policy, but there was very little, almost nothing, to ensure that democracy is monitored after accession. And although we had the Article 7 nuclear option, which, as we know, even before Poland registered its opposition, was very unlikely to be activated and used. The question about operationalizing the Copenhagen criteria after membership was very much put firmly on the agenda. And I think in this respect, we have seen a number of delayed developments, but nevertheless very important developments. And the first one I will very much welcome is the fact that now there is monitoring that has been put in place with regards to all existing EU member states. And this has come in the form of the rule of law monitoring reports. And we have seen 2 reports have already been published that compare developments in all EU member states with a focus on the strength of EU institutions, quality of media and media pluralism. And this is a very interesting and important development that has addressed one of the biggest concerns in terms of discriminating Eastern European states versus Western European states. I think the second key focus, which is important to highlight, is the fact that it's no longer just about formal institutions, because the EU for a very long period of time, especially in the late 90s and early noughties, has very much focused on driving its democracy promotion in the form of legislative measures and formal institutions. And we are now very much aware of the limits to studying just formal institutions. And there is wealth of research highlighting how formal institutions are not undermined, but also how they can be exploited and used. And in many cases, we can witness surface compliance without having any meaningful positive developments on the ground. And one area which I think is has more recently come to be considered in a more constructive and detailed way is the importance of media pluralism, media freedom, and media independence. And again, I think that although it has come to close attention because of developments in Hungary and Poland, there is now a strong awareness that democracy cannot function without the right to having access to different points of view and information. And precisely because this information has been spread in Western and Eastern Europe, this had undermined European unity. This is the reason why media pluralism has come also very much at the heart of EU debate. And this is very much linked to the debate about EU disinformation. So there are a range of different challenges that the EU is facing and dealing with, and now delayed, even though it has come to look at this important developments. Is this enough? I don't think, sorry, Hartmut, I'm just about to, yeah, do I have like 5 minutes? It's okay, yeah, 2 minutes, and I'm just going to end on a positive note. So to wrap up some of the key developments, what I would like to say is that some of the 2 biggest, perhaps, myths about the impact of the EU on the quality of democracy have been challenged. The first one is the limits of EU's transformative power. And here, to give perhaps some positive developments or positive message, for a very long time, it was believed that the EU can influence democracy only with the help of the EU membership perspective. And again, positive developments in Ukraine, even before what has just happened in terms of enhancing the quality of democracy, rule of law, and fight against corruption, have shown that the EU can have an important and strong impact, even without the prospect of EU membership. And this pushes us to think about how the EU can best leverage its impact and why. And the second one is that democracy does not need to be promoted only before accession, but also after accession. And the challenges that the EU is facing are now of a completely different nature that can undermine the unity of democracy in Western and in Eastern European countries. So some steps have been taken. This is an important development, but more needs to be done. And the prospect of extending EU membership perspective to Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, I think is going to put enlargement back to the pack on top of the EU agenda, with a reinforced focus on how to make sure that these countries are not just drifting away from democracy and from EU influence, because what the EU has done for a very long period of time has been a grave strategic miscalculation on its impact and significance to the Western Balkans.
On strategic miscalculations, we ended, and that might be a way of linking all the three presentations on miscalculations, strategic thinking, and strategic thinking not only in military strategy, but also about the European project as such, which is highlighted in the conference. I invite the audience to ask questions, and there are two ways for those who are not that familiar. There is the chat function and there's the Q&A function. My preference would be to use the Q&A function, but if you use the chat function, that's also fine. But from sort of a moderator's point of view, switching between these two is a bit more complicated than sticking to one. So I encourage everyone to ask questions through the Q&A. We do have, however, already a question through the chat function, and that is from Yves to Samuel. And this is all about some observers tend to say that the EU tends to basically follow the United States in the Ukrainian crisis rather than developing their own policies. And I might link that to the notion of, and you mentioned, strategic autonomy, or more specifically, as Antonio Miseroli points out, I mean, it is an appropriate level of strategic autonomy that we're actually talking about when we talk about strategic autonomy. Where are we with these debates? And I know it's not only confined to the military aspects of Europeans' position. Has the environment, has the American need, has the crisis fundamentally changed our perceptions on the debate on the strategic autonomy? Samuel.
Thanks, Hartmut and Yves. Not to be too long. First, it seems to me that the European Union was particularly reactive, efficient, and united at first. Think about President von der Leyen, Charles Michel, Borrell, but also a lot of MEPs, right? And Macron and Scholz and the others. At this level, I think it's quite unique, actually, historically, this level of convergence and reactivity. I do think that many people, experts, stakeholders in Washington, D.C. were surprised by this rapid reaction of the Europeans. Second, it was clear to everyone, including the French, that the defense of Europe, and actually it was the narrative of former President Hollande yesterday on France Inter, the defense of Europe must still go through NATO. The question of the articulation of NATO and the European Union, which is a really old question, right, is still on the table. And thus, the idea of a European policy that will be distinct from the US or from NATO, or probably both, if we follow the narratives of Le Pen or Mélenchon or Zemmour in the current French presidential campaign, is and will be relative, right? Because it's still not clear what strategic autonomy means. And probably in Brussels, but also from Riga to Lisbon, from Rome to Paris, and so on, the definition of strategic autonomy is still not the same. Same for European sovereignty, same for geopolitical commission. You have these labels, but with different definitions, interpretations, and the interest in reflecting of the articulation and hierarchy of resources and instruments according to the threats and issues at stake. And back to that, but this is the idea at the heart of the concept of flexilateralism. It's like, obviously, it depends from one threat to another one. Probably the political answer shouldn't be the same for terrorist attack, for a war in the European neighborhood, for to do and to fix some problems in the Sahel and so on, climate change and other kind of so heavy and important strategic threats. And that's why we have to continue to talk in a transnational way, and to find common positions. But a last point, history helps us to know and to understand the fact that European defense policy has grown up always in a kind of bottom-up dynamic by really concrete, simple projects and programs. And maybe we can laugh about them, but it has worked. Whereas when Europeans and European leaders try to go more top-down, it has been and still really much more complicated. That's why, in my view, I don't have that much expectation about the strategic compass, boussole stratégique, because it's just at the end of the day a paper. Whereas I think this kind of industrial project, like the SCAF, like the fighter jet or the Eurodrone, like the governance of the European defense policy, qualified majority or not, institutionalization of the budget or not, are key if European leaders want really deeply to integrate these public policy and public policies at the European level and go beyond this intergovernmental order.
We can't hear you, Hartmut.
I guess.
Sorry, Calypso, do you want to come in on what Samuel had to say, or on this concept of flexilateralism? Does this replace the old one voice, one army European foreign policy mantra that you have been engaging with and arguing against it for a long time? Does Samuel bail Europe out by saying flexilateralism or European capacity, is a new concept for some of the tensions that we never solved before? Calypso.
Well, I mean, we can put labels on something that's very simple. Europe has always advanced through different kind of coalitions, North-South or small big countries, or, and moving coalitions. And coalitions are good. And we also know that the one voice mantra, works in some cases, and in other cases, it's better to show the world that we're diverse. But I think you're right. I mean, Samuel is absolutely right to talk about, to be a bit doubtful about some of those big pronouncements, strategic compass, etc. But we can ask as good social scientists, under what conditions does it make sense to try to be as autonomous as possible as Europe, but at which level? I prefer to use an idea of circles of autonomy. What we have learned with COVID is that whether as individuals or groups, we have different, your family is one circle of autonomy when you're isolating, your neighborhood, your city, your country, sub-regions. A lot of the COVID response was organized, regionally. When it comes to industry, it's the same. Supply chain, well, sometimes they're local, sometimes they can be within Europe, sometimes they have to be in a broader way. And same for organizing your defense. So there is not to have one monolithic idea of what Europe's strategic autonomy ought to be or can be, whether it's industrial, in the industry of defense that Sam was talking about, like the Eurodrone, whether it's the industry of superconductor, whether it's or whether it's what the intervention forces, whatever we're talking about, there are different sizes of circles of autonomy. So it's not really a vertical idea. It's overlapping circles, overlapping scales. And in a way, thinking strategically cuts across the military domain, the economic domain, the democratic domain. I think that's part of what modernity is about, is thinking across scale, translating exigency of autonomies across across scales and in a kind of fluid, I mean, these days, OECD likes to talk about agile governance. So it's about being agile. At different moments in time, the size and scope of your circle of autonomy will change. And the key for Europe is to be ready and flexible to adapt the size of these circles of autonomy. Now, with NATO and with the US, yeah, these days, I heard the same interview, Samuel, of Hollande, you know, it's like the socialists, whatever remains of them in France, you know, rediscover, you know, the good old Atlantic Alliance in a big way, which is fascinating. And, you know, but whoever doubted it, and there's always been variations on the theme, you know, the European pillar inside NATO, and we will say more of that. So I don't hold my breath in kind of having a radical change. I'm really more with Samuel on this.
Thanks. I see that people want to ask questions through the Q&A, and there might be a technical barrier. So please, I mean, I see one from Graziella. Please come through the chat instead, if you want to. I mean, one of the things I picked up from Ellie, and it's quite right, that enlargement is back on the agenda. If you read the paper, this is the application for membership from Ukraine, from Moldova, from Georgia. Is there pressure on the Western Balkans and so on? Ellie, can you help us speculate a little bit whether this is just crisis communication and it looks good, but in reality, there isn't that much of an enlargement prospect under any circumstances? And wouldn't it be better to admit it, or do we need something now? Or is it indeed the case that, you know, 2 weeks in a war is an extremely long time, and we see something we've never seen before, the most rapid inclusion of new members for reasons that we're all aware of? Ellie, can you enlighten those policy people, the observers from outside? Is it realistic? Is it not realistic? What do you think will happen?
Thank you, Hartmut. Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think what has happened, again, to draw a broader parallel, Poland has for a very long time tried to expand European perspective to include Ukraine, and this has been very much rejected straight away by some existing member states, including France, has not been keen. I mean, just the whole debate of committing to enlargement that is beyond now the Western Balkans was unthinkable a few weeks ago. So I think that in that respect, this has changed. What we have seen is not only some EU member states very actively pushing for Ukraine to be granted a candidate status, but I think it's absolutely remarkable to see that the European Council has already forwarded and asked the Commission to prepare an opinion on the applications from Ukraine, from Moldova, and from Georgia. I mean, again, in the case, I'm trying to remember, I think in the case of Albania, the European Council waited, I think, more than 1 year before it formally asked the Commission to launch the process and start preparing an application, an opinion on the application of Albania. So it's quite remarkable to see that there has been some action. I don't think that Ukraine is going to join the EU tomorrow, but I think it's likely that soon we will expect some positive development in terms of recognition as a candidate country. I cannot foresee, I mean, I think it's highly unlikely that the European Union will turn around and say, after all the warm words and embraces, and especially what is happening, that Ukraine cannot be considered a candidate country. The question that follows on from that is, I mean, again, what does it mean for enlargement in the context of the Western Balkans? So I think that the crisis has provided an opportunity to inject momentum into EU's thinking, how it can exercise its influence in the Western Balkans, because, I mean, again, we've talked about enlargement being almost on life support. So almost nothing has been happening. There was this pretense, the chapters will be opened, but even, I mean, again, if we look at the front runners, Serbia and Montenegro, there has been very little progress. In the case of Serbia, we have seen democratic backsliding and increasing autocratization, but there have been concerns about development in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I think that suddenly EU is waking up that enlargement, what it used to be, is to extend the zone of prosperity and peace across the continent. And so there is now, the calculation before is that there is very little economic gain from enlargement with the Western Balkans. It was not an immediate issue, and public opinion in most Western European countries was against it. So I think all this has now changed. But precisely, and I mean, again, it's incredibly sad that we are witnessing a war in Europe, that this is absolutely, I would argue, changing the whole debate about what the EU is for, it's about, and how it should be promoting peace, prosperity, and what it should do. So in a nutshell, I think we will not witness Ukraine becoming a member in the next 2 weeks, but I'm definitely expecting probably soon that there will be a decision on a candidate status, and I would imagine that this will signal a very, very, very important shift. And what the EU does is, once there is message to certain groups of countries, they're very important to send message to other countries involved in this process. So I think that there is also soon will be positive developments on the opening of the accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania. There has been rumors that Bulgaria is willing to lift its veto. So I would expect some movement on this front. But the most interesting question is how the EU will rethink its EU enlargement policy, because it has taken way too long to advance, whether there will some sort of functional integration in key sectors, and then gradual closer political integration. But I think that, yeah, discussions about enlargement and how to do and engage definitely back on the agenda.
Thank you. Calypso wanted to come in. I see your hand. And do you want to respond to the same question, or do you want to?
Yeah, comment, you know me, comment on everything. Well, in this case, I just wrote a book called A Citizen's Guide to the Rule of Law, why we must defend the most precious invention of humankind that Oxford was kind to advertise last year. So it's a really big issue in my view too, but also I just want to note the irony of the eagerness to take in a country as a candidate country when we are not able to do anything to ensure that it remains a country. So kind of let's note this for the moment, because we don't know if there will be a country to be candidate. Second thing is, I think what Eddie said about Poland is really important for us to note, that we want to think rightly, I guess, about the EU as the entity that erases borders between countries. But let's never forget that the EU creates borders, creates really, really hard borders. That once upon a time, the border between Ukraine and Poland was super porous. In fact, there are all these Ukrainian Polish families that kind of lived around that border. And what the EU enlargement did was create a wall there, pushing the Iron Curtain on that side. I mean, I'm exaggerating, it wasn't completely iron, but it's pretty hard for Ukrainian to come in the EU before the war, right? So in a way, the irony is that in Poland has always yearned for the kind of like come back to the status quo, Ukraine too, obviously, but we've changed that part of the world through a border. Let's not forget that. Thirdly, so I mean, I subscribe to everything Ellie said on the council response, but I mean, how it's so important to, let's imagine that there's still a country, whenever. It is so important to really draw the lessons from the mistakes of the past, from enlargement fatigue, from so-called backsliding, etc. And I would say that, yes, there are tensions that have to do with what Elie was saying, that it shouldn't be a checklist. And the EU, although we've been saying this for so long, continues to some extent to have checklists. And indeed, we just did this report for the EP called Binding the Guardian, critiquing some of the country report and some of what the EU says, because I mean, there are double standards. You look at Bulgaria, for instance, one of the countries that we look at in this report, and really Bulgaria is a totally systematic lack of accountability for the abuse against journalists. The Supreme Judicial Council is completely politicized, etc. But it hasn't really been highlighted, even in the monitoring reports. But perhaps more fundamentally, Tom Thunes wrote a great piece about that. There is a fundamental tension that we really don't grapple with between promoting governance and promoting democracy in your neighborhood, in the enlargement country and in neighborhood country that are not a candidate. That is, you give a country a checklist. This is all the things you need to do. And then you also say, well, you need to build your democracy, empower your civil society, empower your parliament vis-a-vis the executive. Now, how can we do both things as the EU? There is a great contradiction because you disempower. And indeed, at the end of the day, as Elie was saying, you also empower autocrats through this technique. And we could go more into this. But this is this fundamental political tension that the EU needs to deal with. And the final thing I want to say is that we are going to be talking about enlargement to Ukraine, candidate country, etc. We know that if we do learn our lessons, actually, it's going to take a really, really long time. This is not going to happen instantaneously. How do we manage expectations? And the expectations are economic, technical, but they're also about security, because we need to embed this conversation in the next months and years in a real conversation about the European security architecture that Samuel was talking about. And that has to do with, we can't divorce it from EU enlargement. We can't divorce it from interacting with Russia. So we can't think enlargement separately from the security architecture that is supposed to go with NATO. But perhaps Samuel has some comments to make on this. And it's not a way to echo Putin, because you can say both, condemn him 100%, and at the very same time said that there is an issue we never grappled with since the end of the Cold War.
Samuel, your co-panelists invited you to comment on the future of the security architecture, and I encourage all other panelists to go into both the Q&A and the chat function, because there's one question in the Q&A about the future of Europe conference and whether the timetable can be sustained and the targets are set. And then there is the question about democracy and sovereignty and French initiatives, and whether democracy always means deepening integration or whether there are other forms. And I encourage everyone to read the specific question and then think about who wants to respond. But Samuel, I'm keen to hear your visions of a future of a European security architecture, something that we're all longing for. And can you tell me what role the EU plays, other institutions, member states? Is this clear? Obviously not. Do we have a vision? Probably many. Are they realistic? You are the expert, you tell us. Samuel.
But including Russia?
Including Russia.
Question mark.
And
if Russia survives, Calypso, as a country.
Yes. And there is also another question, actually, I think, to Calypso, written by Nicola. But yes, in a few minutes, because you give me the opportunity, and try not to repeat myself about NATO, strategic autonomy, France, or the main EU institutions, maybe I could add one thing about bilateral relationships in Europe and outside the European Union. I think there is here one main articulation between the European Union and EU institutions and initiatives and instruments and so on. But also, I do think that it won't be possible to reform this institutional architecture of security defense just inside the European Union, because it's so difficult to find ambitious positions with 27 people around the table, and because unfortunately, again, the strategic cultures are so different still inside and among the 27. So I think another way to try to find some convergences and at the end of the day solutions would be also between and especially, and not want by that to exclude other member states. It's like just another layer, but between France and Germany. And especially with the new coalition, the last speech given by Chancellor Scholz was pretty. I was pretty impressed about it, right? Because it wasn't obvious that this coalition with the Green, with the Social Democrats, could reach these positions. So obviously the situation won't be the same if Macron will be re-elected or not. Obviously, if Le Pen, Zemmour or Mélenchon will become a president of the French Republic, it won't be the same game, it won't be the same story. But if Macron or Jadot, the other pro-European, I would say, a candidate, will be elected, I would say that France and Germany have to push really hard on the same direction. I think they can do it, but then, and one really concrete example is about administration and administrative fusion. I think we have to go to this direction, and for example, to have some common, bilateral, common Franco-German bureaucracies. And obviously it's so difficult politically speaking, it's so complicated in terms of bureaucratic interests, but here we never talk about it, and I think it could be a really strong game changer, obviously not just for France and Germany, but for all the European Union. About Russia, the question is so sensitive, so difficult, especially in this Ukrainian moment, as Calypso said before, that I think we have to wait a bit on that one, and still European leaders can do a lot inside the European Union, outside the European Union, in multilateral, minilateral arena, inside NATO, and also the bilateral relationship. And the first one, I mean, as a French scholar and French citizen, I think should be the Franco-German relationship. Could be another time that the Franco-German relation could be the engine of these, I don't know, a shift or at least changes in this domain.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, Samuel, for pushing for the bilateral renewal of the Franco-German alliance and making a contribution to overall European developments. Calypso, we have unfortunately only 2 minutes left, and I allocate the 2 questions that are there. Will we meet the targets of the Conference on the Future of Europe, timetable and so on? And the big question about democracy and sovereignty. But again, because the next panel starts at 3:30 and we need to give people a bit of a break, it's 2 minutes for 2 big questions. Calypso.
Targets, no idea, nothing harder to predict than the future, but hopefully, yes, they're making big efforts. Regarding the bigger question of, do we advance through crisis and how? I would, say that first of all, I think it's fair to say that crisis leads European publics and their leaders to say more or less generally, on the what question, Europe needs to do more, and that's what we're seeing today, more integrative. But on the how question, it's increasingly clear that it doesn't mean more centralization. It can mean more in all sorts of ways, bilateral, plurilateral, at lower levels, cities. That's what we're saying. So more integrative on the what, more sovereignist on the how. And so you ask whether is there a tension between sovereignty and democracy? Very big question. And I think at first sight, yes. And for Macron, sovereignty came first, European sovereignty, this autonomy we've been talking about, because sovereignty requires hard instruments, requires hard coordination. Usually it's the executives that do that, and it can be about core state powers. But at the same time, we also are starting to see, and I think Macron too, and the French presidency too, that indeed a sovereignty, a European sovereignty that is sustainable over time has to be grounded on legitimacy. And legitimacy requires not just national or European sovereignty, but popular sovereignty. You know, these are the good old hats, but we are seeing it expressed in many different ways. And I would say that's where we are today, to reinvent what transnational popular sovereignty is. And hopefully the French presidency will add its sense of how those two things go together, sovereignty and democracy.
Thank you, Calypso. We couldn't have a better link to the second panel, which will focus on the French presidency. So it's for me to thank all speakers in reverse order, Ellie, Calypso, and Samuel, to start us off with an excellent panel, presentations, responses to questions. We take a 5-minute break, and I look forward to the more focused, concentrated debates on the French presidency. So thanks to all speakers.
So we'll begin again. May I ask the speakers, also those from the previous panel, to open their video, because we would like to make a screenshot of the initiative and have you all present. Thank you very much. So now we switch to the second panel, which will focus on France in the EU. Perhaps I would be less optimistic than Calypso, who said that legitimacy requires sovereignty and transnational popular sovereignty. I mean, to some extent, a good crisis is always good for the legitimacy of those who govern. And for example, now it is nearly sure that Macron will be re-elected as the French president. But the question now is more about the role of France in the EU, and we'll take also some historical perspective from the past to the present. France acts in a peculiar way in the EU, very proactive on the one hand, but also a very centralized country, which does not really understand what federalism or confederalism is. And we'll discuss these questions with three speakers. Alienor Ballangé, who is a junior researcher at the University of Frankfurt, and also linked to Oxford, who will speak on the French genealogy of the European integration, from Paul Goethe to Jacques Delors. Then we'll have Olivier Costa, who is a senior researcher at the CEVIPOF, Sciences Po, and at the College of Europe, Bruges, who will speak about the French conceptions of the political regime of the Union, an analysis of the investiture of the von der Leyen Commission, and Pauline Schnapper, who is professor at Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle, and who will speak on the post-Brexit Franco-British bilateral relationship. Alienor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Yves. First of all, of course, I cannot but join my colleagues in their words about the very tragic situation in Ukraine, even if personally, and because I only have 15 minutes and you all said a lot of very interesting and very important things about the situation. So I won't go back to this very important issue, but rather maybe develop what was the beginning of the discussion between Calypso and Yves, and also Nicolas Arendt in the chat, regarding the relationship between sovereignty, democracy, and especially between popular sovereignty and national sovereignty, linked to the history of the French political culture in the European integration. So I'm pleased to introduce this second panel of the workshop, devoted to France's place in the EU and the French presidency of the Council. I will try to be brief and will only suggest some milestones that I hope to have the pleasure of discussing with the colleagues who will follow me. Specialized in political thought and the history of ideas, I will focus on the way in which French political and philosophical culture has consciously and unconsciously influenced the history of the European integration. Based on Justine Lacroix's work on La pensée française à l'épreuve de l'Europe, published in 2008, and on the results obtained in my book, published last month by the Édition de la Sorbonne, I will suggest that the presidency of Emmanuel Macron introduces a paradigm shift in the way France is representing itself in the EU. And I intend to present the hypothesis that the Gaullo-Mitterrandian consensus, from the name of the two French presidents, de Gaulle and Mitterrand, has long lived the failure of the constitutional treaty, and that a Rousseauist representation of Europe has progressively been replaced by a Kantian representation of Europe, marked by a normative cosmopolitanism rather than by the promotion of the volonté générale. So in the first part of my presentation, I would like to present what appears to me as the original source of French thinking of Europe, the Rousseauist approach to continental unification. During the second half of the 18th century, two founding texts prepared the foundation for French and German Europe, the projects for perpetual peace by Rousseau on the one hand, and of course, by Kant on the other hand. Schematically, Rousseau's thought on Europe led to the nonconformists of the 30s, including Emmanuel Mounier and Denis de Rougemont, and then to contemporary thinkers such as Pierre Manant, Marcel Gauchet, or Paul Thibault, whom Justin Lacroix proposes to include in the intellectual family of national sovereigntists. If the Kantian approach to Europe is essentially based on public and cosmopolitical law, Rousseau's approach is essentially based on culture and politics. As he writes in the first pages of his project of perpetual peace, it is first, and I quote him, priesthood and the empire that united the peoples of Europe. In other words, religion and politics. This conviction is enrooted in the general economy of the political thought of Rousseau. It is the volonté générale that gives the body politics its unity and identity, and that allows the contrat social to resist the assaults of divergent individual interests. If we apply this idea to Europe, it is therefore the feeling of belonging to the same political project that alone can give the European political community its true body. Political sovereignty and the sovereignty of the political stem from the subordination of law and economy to the volonté générale. But this sovereignty is also based on a refusal to subsume the peoples of Europe under the disembodied figure of a European individual without idiosyncratic land or culture. As Rousseau laments in his Considérations sur le gouvernement de Pologne, I quote, "These days, whatever else one may say, there are no longer any Frenchmen, Englishmen, Germans, or Spaniards. There are only Europeans, and these Europeans are everywhere in their country," unquote. In other words, a Europe that would lose its national idiosyncrasies would be precarious and unfaithful to its own history. It must therefore, according to Rousseau, therefore be based both on strong political integration and on respect for national cultural differences. This first representation of a primarily political and sovereigntist Europe deeply influenced the French intellectuals who fought for the very first time the transition from the cultural and philosophical Europe of the United States of Europe to the political Europe of the European community. As I suggest in my book, the first age of European integration, which extends from the 30s to the Congress of The Hague in 1948, is marked by a strong influence of the French representation of Europe. By this, I mean the post-Rousseauist conviction that Europe must be conceived as a political community composed of sovereign nations and national cultures that are close but must remain diverse. This Europe à la Française is particularly carried by those who Jean-Louis Loubet-Delbecq gathers under the label of the nonconformists of the 30s, namely those young intellectuals gathered around the Revue Esprit and the École du Riage. Practitioners as much as theoreticians, these contemptuous of liberalism as much as of socialism, conceive the idea of a Europe of the third way, founded on the double idea of community and personality. This community is political rather than cosmopolitical and normative because it must be based on real rather than on ideal criteria. It must respect the rooting of people in their national cultural territories. And for that reason, they raised the principle of subsidiarity as a regulating principle of European Confederation. This political culture, which has the nostalgia of an organic people à la Michelet, and the Republican government based on a clear and homogeneous volonté générale is to be found in the ambiguities of a France that had remained sovereigntist for a very long time in the integration process. The Gaulo-Mitterrandian consensus lasted at least for some 40 years until the hope of a Europe understood as an extension of the French great nation lost its vigor with successive enlargement and with the ordo-liberal conception of a market regulated by independent agencies rather than by a politically sovereign economic government. Because I must stick here to my 15 minutes format, I will simply mention two examples that seems to me to illustrate the persistence of this Rousseauist conception of Europe in the France of the European community. Then I think it's changed in the European Union. The opposition, first, the opposition of the European difference community in the early 50s and the promotion of an organized and centralized economic model for Europe. Today, it sounds surprising to hear French journalists claiming that European neighbors finally seem to be listening to France's repeated request to set up a European defense. In fact, it was France which at this time was overwhelmingly opposed to the idea of a common defense that caused the first major crisis in the European community. Originally, the Monet-Pleven project devised the creation of a European army that would integrate future German units into a single European military and political authority. This common defense project, which also included the institutional project of a European political community, aroused a great deal of reticence in France, whereas it was accepted by most other Western states. It was finally rejected by the National Assembly in August 1954, following a clear no vote among Gaullist and communist representatives. While, of course, many historical and geopolitical explanations complicate an overly ideological understanding of this rejection, it should be noted, I think, that the Communist Party and the Gaullist Party first denounced what appeared to them to be an unacceptable surrender of national sovereignty. This is evidenced by de Gaulle in a press conference in February 1953, where he linked the EDC to, I quote, an enterprise that would have the effect of reducing the French people to the status of an instrument subject to the discretion of others, unquote. He added that this project was only a confused fiction and that politically it was the camouflage of the national abdication. After specifying that France was different from the other states and asked, I quote, why would France not be France? De Gaulle returned to his own representation of the European Confederation, still extremely marked by the Rousseauist unconscious. According to de Gaulle, not only is the cosmopolitical normative model a confused fiction, as opposed to the idea of a contrat social within which the states lose neither, I quote, their body, nor their soul, nor their figure in a common organism. For him, this political body must be legitimized by the volonté générale, and in this case, a popular and democratic foundation. It is, according to de Gaulle, the people who must create the European Confederation. The first step must be a vast referendum, and there will be there a great force to support those who want this community. Volonté générale, sovereignty, respect for national idiosyncrasies and subordination of the economy and law to politics, all the elements mentioned above are to be found in this Gaulo-Rousseauist representation of Europe. Before concluding, I would like to address the question of the competitive market and the French search for a European economic government. Until the 80s, the ordo-liberal model of a competitive market based primarily on an economic constitution, that is to say, an economic law rather than on political decision, was regularly questioned by the France of de Gaulle and Pompidou, who claimed the need to give an economic government as opposed to an economic constitution to Europe. In the French conception, only the political power, as the body with the legitimate power conferred by the people, is likely to determine the main orientations of the European integration process. Rather than conforming to rules that limit the power of national leaders and restrict their ability to adapt to global political and economic fluctuations, the advocate of intergovernmental interventionism intend to be able to react sovereignly and, if necessary, in a discretionary manner to the uncertainties of the integrated economic system. Gradually, though, faced with the danger of Germany unilaterally assuming the role of economic leader, Mitterrand aligned himself with the ordoliberal model of an increasing constitutionalization of European economic policies. Now I come to my conclusion, which I would like to formulate as a transition to the colleagues who will follow me, and perhaps most particularly Olivier Costa, whose intervention will focus on French conception of the EU political regimes as regards the von der Leyen Commission. Justin Lacroix's book was published in 2008, so before the financial and economic crisis of the years 2010, before the refugee crisis in 2015, and of course before the COVID crisis. In it, she seems to conclude that the national sovereignties representation of those who denounce a disembodied Europe predominates both consciously and unconsciously in the French political landscape and public opinion. This popular rejection of the European Constitutional Treaty, followed soon by the feeling of a betrayal of the elites as French representatives ratified a barely modified treaty, is one of her best examples. Symbolically, the hope of a European à la Convened, resulting from a theoretical synthesis between French and German approaches, would have been stillborn with the election of Nicolas Sarkozy and the ratification of Lisbon Treaty. However, it seems that the era of the years 2010, with its free economic, social, and health crisis, has prepared the conditions for the renewal of French thinking on Europe. So from there, I wonder, and I ask you all, if the election of Emmanuel Macron does not mark the transition to a new paradigm. If we take, and I will stop there, if we take the two examples mentioned above, the European Common Defense and the economic government, it seems that the government and part of the public opinion, even if I think it's a bit more delicate regarding the public opinion, are defending a federal leap in European sovereignty, while at the same time, the European institutions seems to be moving closer to the old French model of an economic government via the recovery plan and the idea of mutualization. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Alienor, for allowing us to take this reflexive historical distance with the present and understand the moves that have taken place in the last couple of decades. I welcome Olivier de France, who has joined us. Olivier is a senior researcher at St. Antony's College and at the Iris. He will speak on France and Europe's foreign policy identity, but my suggestion is that we give first the floor to Olivier Costa, which perhaps goes on with the discussion which Alienor has opened a bit better, and then we'll shift to Olivier de France. So Olivier Costa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yves.
Sorry, Olivier. Thank you also, Alienor, for keeping the time.
J'ai compris le message. Thank you, Yves, for reminding me about that quarter. Let me just check on the time. That's fine. I will stick to it. So my point here was to try to discuss a bit about the French vision of European integration, or at least the current vision of the current team, the Macron vision of European integration. And my intention here is to go a bit beyond the interviews, the speeches that I usually analyze, and to look at more concrete aspect of that vision. So this is a work that could be done just looking at the French presidency of the Council, but I have chosen to focus on another sequence that was very interesting, which was the appointment of the von der Leyen Commission. It is becoming a very interesting political process because the treaties, as you know, have been modified several times, and we are now to a point where there's some dispute about how to analyze that sequence and how to interpret that sequence and how things should be handled. The Lisbon Treaty has created a very complicated situation regarding the appointment of the Commission because it has created, as you know, a link with European election. It has given a very strong role to the European Parliament in the selection of the president. There is also the Spitzenkandidaten process. And so this had multiple impacts on the way this appointment is conducted. 20 years ago, it was a strictly intergovernmental negotiation, meeting of the European Council, basically deciding on who will be the president and who will be the members. And now it has developed in something quite different. It pushes the candidates to develop a political discourse, a political program, in order to make it to the election with the Spitzenkandidaten sequence, and then to make it as a president, to be elected, because this is the wording chosen by the treaty, as a president. And this gives a bonus to candidates with a strong political profile. The European Parliament is willing to get involved in the process, not only to vote at the end, but maybe also to choose a candidate. The European political parties are pretending to play a role in that story, and they had nothing to say in the 1990s. And also the appointment of the Commission is becoming part of a wider political negotiation, which is linked to the allocation of all the top positions within the EU, presidency of the European Council, of the central bank, the high representative. And so there is a very complex game, and even the president of the European Parliament is involved in that kind of negotiation. So it is transforming, in a way, the whole logic of the European Union political system and the way it operates. If we go back to the sequence of 2019, it has been very chaotic, as you know, a lot of tensions, strategies, and stunts. And from an analytical point of view, it's interesting because we can analyze what happened around Weber and Timmermans and von der Leyen and also the members of the Commission as the consequences of very contrasted views among players on how things should be organized. And this has been echoed by the media, who have given very different readings of what was happening there. Why could not Manfred Weber make it or not? Why von der Leyen was selected? And if we consider the French dimension of the story, what was very interesting is the analysis of the Goulard story. Why was she, in a way, sacked by the European Parliament? And in fact, we have here readings of the way things should be managed regarding the appointment of the Commission, and some readings of what happened with von der Leyen and Goulard that are very close to theoretical readings of what the European Union is. So basically, politicians and journalists, most of them, they don't know these theories, but it just proves that the theories we have to understand the EU are relevant because they are connected to social reality and also to the perception and also the strategies of actors. So the point here, to make a long story very simple, is to say that the ambiguities of the EU political system as it stands today, the uncertainties about how the procedure of appointment of the Commission should go, has created a situation of conflict between a certain number of interpretation of how things should be handled, and especially is that procedure, does that procedure needs to be politicized or not? And so we had a tension between three visions of the story, a very intergovernmental approach, a more community approach around the interaction between the EP and the Commission, and a more, I would say, political approach, which connects very much the story with the public opinion, the result of the election, and so on. And we see that those various approaches were shared by people depending on their political orientations, their institution, but also their nationality. And here we come to the French vision of that story. So in sum, we can use 12 different theories to analyze what's going on in the EU. We could stick here just to the three very simple approaches, the meta theories that still dominate the analysis of the EU, intergovernmentalist or new intergovernmentalist approach, a new functional approach, and a post-functional approach. All of them, they offer a very comprehensive reading of how European integration is going on and how the political system should work, and especially how the appointment of the Commission should be handled. So if we go back to the von der Leyen sequence, we had the Spitzenkandidaten in 2019. It did not go as far as 2014, but still it was there. Really much stick to the analysis Martin Westlake is making of the sequence, showing that the Spitzenkandidaten procedure has been there, not to the end, but still there. We all know that Manfred Weber, the lead candidate of the EPP, couldn't make it by a lack of support of the European Council and even the European Parliament. After a very confused sequence, Ursula von der Leyen was chosen, but quite in line with the Spitzenkandidaten logic. She's from the EPP, she's a German, and then other elements, other criteria were taken into account. The criteria of gender, because you remember that a lot of actors were pushing to have for the first time a woman at the head of the Commission, and also some criteria, I would say, of competence and experience. She has been a minister, she's speaking excellent French and English, which was not the case of Weber, and so she was fit for the job. As you remember, people in the European Parliament were not very happy about that choice. Von der Leyen has never been an MEP. She has not been elected in 2019, not running for the European election. And and in the Commission, I would say that the visions were a bit contrasted. Von der Leyen has anyway made it. She has designed a program in order to unite the main groups in the European Parliament, the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Liberals, and even a bit the Greens, and to try to satisfy the European Council. She was elected, because this is the word, by a narrow margin of 9 votes within the European Parliament, and then started the very difficult sequence of the choice of the other members of the Commission. There were very strong negotiations here between the member states, but also between the institution, between the European political parties, who play a very key role here in imposing that the Socialists and the Christian Democrats and the Liberals would have first vice president or executive vice presidents and so on. And so at the end of the day, the EP organized the hearings in view of a vote. Then the sequence of the hearings in front of the EP became quite chaotic. 2 candidates were dismissed even before being heard on matters of probity. And then some other candidates had a very hard time. And this was the case of Sylvie Goulard, the French candidate chosen by Emmanuel Macron. She was facing two problems. She has been funded during a term as an MEP by a US think tank, but to a very high level, something like 10K a month, which is a bit too much to advise a think tank. And she was also involved in that story of the parliamentary assistant that were in fact used by the Modem, the centrist party in France, and working in Paris and not in Brussels and Strasbourg. And because of those stories, Goulard had to resign from a position of Ministry of Defense in France in 2017. So people were wondering within the European Parliament, why is Goulard not qualified to become a minister, but why could she become a commissioner? Are there different rules of probity applying to ministers and to commissioners? She went through 2 very difficult hearings. There was a strong fight between Macron and the European Parliament and the European political parties. And finally, Macron had to accept the idea that Goulard would not be appointed by the European Parliament, because here the European Parliament has a veto. The European Parliament, at the end of the hearing process, needs to vote on the College of Commissioners. It's quite easy for the European Parliament to say we will not vote until that candidate is not removed. And so finally, Macron was obliged to appoint someone else. That was Thierry Breton. And he also had a very hard time because in front of the legal affairs committees, he was only approved by 12 votes against 11. And he had to also go through two hearings. At the end of the day, the commission was approved and the story was over. We can make 3 different readings of what happened there. The first reading would be the intergovernmental view on the whole story. And this would be the French view, the one that has been favored by Macron and the one that has been in a way presented by Macron and his team in the press, in the media, especially in the French media. It's a story of an intergovernmental negotiation going on within the European Council. It is a story of a negotiation which is made between the 27 heads of state and government to choose the president and then to choose the other members of the commission, and then to even distribute the vice presidencies and the portfolio between the members. And Macron has said, I had a deal with Ms. Merkel, with the other members of the European Council, on the name of Sylvie Goulard, on the fact that she would get the portfolio of ECOFIN affairs, and there is a deal here, and there is nothing more to discuss. And then Macron considered that the rejection of Sylvie Goulard was an anomaly, something that was broken in the thing because everything was validated by the European Council with the approval of the President van der Leyen. And Macron insisted very much on the fact that van der Leyen has promised that Goulard would make it to the Commission with the portfolio that was planned. And so Macron considered that the EP was doing too much and trying to control a process with nothing in the treaties allowing the European Parliament to do that. And the final vote of the European Parliament on the college is was a bit presented back to normal. The European Parliament is in a way there to validate the choice made by the European Council and not to decide. A second approach would be the neo-functional approach, which is the one favored by people in the Commission. The story of an autonomous negotiation between the President, van der Leyen, and the members of the European Parliament. The European Council is involved only at the beginning to choose the President in view of the result. And then it's very much up to the President to define his or her program, to choose the candidate proposed by the member states, to decide which portfolios they will get, who will become a vice president or not. And then in that view, the EP hearings are very important, and the EP is totally free to set its own standards and consider that the standards on probity will be super high and will also apply even on French members and not only on members coming from Bulgaria. And so the whole thing has been viewed like a negotiation between the President and the European Parliament, and finally as something normal. So in a neo-functional view, the European Parliament only did its job, and there is nothing wrong in the whole thing. A third view on the whole process would be a post-functional view, paying very much attention to the political dimension, the result of European elections, the reconnection between citizens, election parties, and EU institutions in Brussels. And in that story, the Commission has to take into account the pressure coming from the public opinion to define its program, but also to select its members. If citizens are concerned about the probity of a future commissioner, Madame Goulard cannot be appointed as a member of the Commission, because the European Parliament is there to impose that view. And then if you consider things through a post-functional prism, you can say that there is a political logic at work, a negotiation between the EPP, the Socialists, the Liberal, between the President of the Commission and the European Parliament. And then you will analyze also what happened as a political game. The fact that the Christian Democrat and the Socialists have sacked Ms. Goulart, who was a Renew, as a retaliation for the rejection of the Hungarian candidate who was from the EPP and the Romanian candidate who was from the Socialists. So basically the EPP and the Renew have sacked the EPP and Socialist candidates. So there was a need for a retaliation in order to have some sort of balance. And it's also a sanction for the choice of Macron to sack Manfred Weber or to refuse the possibility of Franz Timmermans to be appointed as president of the Commission. And the final vote of the European Parliament.
Olivier, you should conclude in
1 minute.
1 minute.
Yeah. The final vote of the European Parliament is just the end of that sequence, a new partisan alliance which is solving the case. So what can we conclude from the whole thing? It gives us a very interesting view on how Macron sees the EU, because in his view, the appointment of the Commission was a strictly intergovernmental matter for the European Council. And the European Parliament in that story had nothing to say. And the President of the Commission herself had nothing to say. What is interesting, it is not incompatible with an ambitious vision on European integration. I guess Macron has one, but he considered very much that it should be an intergovernmental process, a bit in the link with the French history of de Gaulle and so on that has been discussed by Alienor. And we have confirmation now of that with the French presidency of the Council. It's mainly about Macron. It's mainly about the European Council. Macron didn't saw that the treaty changed in 2009 and that the presidency does not apply to the European Council because he's behaving as a president of the European Council, and he considered that the European Parliament and the Commission should have a very limited role. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier, for making us understand much better this functioning of the selection process and beyond it of the different views on the EU. I give now the floor to Olivier de France.
Merci, Yves. Hello, everyone. So my name is Olivier de France. Just, I hope you can hear me properly. So just to clarify, I work mainly on European affairs in the empirical sense in Paris at Iris, and over here in Oxford, I work in theoretical terms, mostly on relational theories of Europe. I'm trying to write my doctoral thesis on this. And I work a lot with Calypso. I also wanted to apologize for having missed the first session. It's the miracle and curse of Zoom. I'm afraid I was essentially at a conference on the exact, pretty much the same topic on the French presidency of the EU, and the order of the speakers was late, so unfortunately I couldn't hear. I prefer to hear some of the previous speakers, and this was not possible in this on this occasion, so I apologize for that. On the other hand, it's also a good sign that foreign policy is and European defense is as Samuel was saying, elicits perhaps unfortunately a bit more interest now than a few months ago. If I can just about remember the previous French presidency of the EU in 2008, when there was a great sort of enthusiasm around foreign policy and defense, and Sarkozy tried to update the European security strategy and so on, and these issues had elicited slightly less interest there was less enthusiasm for this and foreign policy and defense during the current French presidency. So it's in a way gratifying that there are these events, and in a way also you know, a bit unfortunate that it happens in a context where we're slightly overtaken by events. But the events are tragically are interesting, of course, tragically interesting. We were talking about this with Calypso earlier this week, and she was asking me, you know, how come the EU is actually exporting arms to the Ukraine? And I had no idea, because you know, if you look at the sort of European peace facility, in my interpretation, it was something that was essentially agreed upon in a context of supplying non-lethal arguments to third-party countries. So I couldn't understand, and we were chatting about this, and it's, I think, very, very, very interesting that it kind of signals a sort of shift, you know, from the EU actually counting on its own sort of legal norms and legal order in order to sort of fashion the world and its own environment according to its own instruments, its toolbox, and its own norms, to a state in which actually, instead of trying to force its own instruments on the world, it's actually refashioning its own instruments according to the evolution of the world and its own strategic landscape. In other words, in terms of the European, it's using its instruments, it's using the European peace facility to furnish non-lethal armaments to the Ukraine, and is in doing so undermining its own logic, its own kind of legal logic of norms. And I think this signals a really kind of fascinating sort of Copernican revolution. The term is a bit overused, but from a point in which the EU saw the world and its strategic environment through the lens of its own treaties and of its own toolbox, to a point where it is willing to break a taboo and actually go so far as to modify its own instruments and its own toolbox in order to actually weigh on conflict in its near abroad, in order to actually use its instruments in order to tip a balance of power in its near abroad. I think this is something that is quite a watershed moment, but I mean we're still trying to understand this. I was also very, very interested to hear Olivier Costa's presentation, and I was actually looking forward to it because I suppose in a way, for me, before listening to Olivier, that moment in Macron's presidency was a bit of a light bulb. It was a bit of a light bulb moment for me, because it was a moment where a president who clearly has a pro-European outlook and a European worldview actually suddenly appeared not to really understand how the EU actually worked. I mean, that was my sort of instinctive, intuitive interpretation. Now I understand, thanks to Olivier, the variety of interpretations of this. But I think it's quite an important moment intellectually, and it provides me with a bridge into the first point I want to make about not so much France and Europe's foreign policy identity, but about, in a way, the problematic identity between French and European foreign policy. It's a bit of a sort of a self-evident point, and I hope you will agree that essentially French and European foreign policy are not one and the same. This is fairly self-evident, and yet I'm not entirely convinced that it's a point that's necessarily widely shared across French foreign policy circles. To give you an example, if you were fortunate or unfortunate enough to be a fly on the wall of some of these meetings of French foreign policy circles, you would probably be forgiven for thinking that Polish scholars and diplomats over the last decade or so were essentially the modern equivalent of the sort of mad Victorian women in the attic of European circles, because they were very, very proactive in the way that they saw the Russian threat and attempted to communicate this in Western Europe. And I think it's a bit of a pity in that context that in Paris, we were not able to listen to them a bit more, simply because we could have picked up a lot more from our Polish partners than was picked up before the invasion of Ukraine. I think in purely foreign policy terms, it should encourage a form of humility. I think particularly France in the European context would gain a lot by listening a bit more, and would have gained a lot from listening a bit more to its partners, particularly its Eastern European partners. In the same way, I think if you had been a fly on the wall in some of these meetings in French foreign policy circle, you would also have been privy to the way in which French scholars and French diplomats are sometimes prone to, I suppose, talking down to particularly to Germany on strategic issues. Now, I suppose this is a kind of fairly classic idea, the idea being that Germany can wear the sort of economic mantle as long as France steadfastly remains the sort of leading light on strategic issues, which actually sometimes makes sense, because I would argue, in view of recent events, I certainly think that France hasn't been wrong over the past 2 decades to emphasize the need for Europeans to do more to ensure their own security. But I would also argue that talking down to the Germans about this, whether you're right or wrong, doesn't work. In any relationship, when you talk down to someone, it usually doesn't register and it ultimately doesn't work. And in the end, I'm not sure that the way France went about this discussion really contributed to furthering German strategic awareness or German strategic consciousness. In fact, it may have slowed it down. I think the discussion on PESCO was particularly indicative of this. Permanent structured cooperation, in which it was a kind of France and Germany were talking across each other, and in the end, France, not because it was wrong on the letter and the spirit of the treaties, but simply in the way it went about the discussion, it ensured that the center of gravity of this discussion went towards Germany and Eastern Europe. So I think on the whole, I suppose France would gain from being a bit less vertical and a bit more horizontal in its European dealings, in the way it goes about European foreign policy. Now, I suppose you could argue that that's not necessarily intuitive for France. Simply the way the country is set up, the way the Fifth Republic is set up. The French, you could probably argue that the French leader, particularly in matters of foreign policy, which are essentially his précaré, sometimes confuses the constitution of the Fifth Republic with the Lisbon Treaty. It's essentially because that's what the president does on the domestic scene, and I think that also explains some of the mindset and the mentality behind what Olivier was explaining, that episode with the von der Leyen Commission and the Sylvie Goulard moment. Essentially, Macron was saying, I was democratically elected. I mean, I have legitimacy, and this is my candidate that I nominate for the European Commission. And why don't I have the legitimacy? There's also a symmetric point I want to make, however, in terms of this problematic identity that sometimes France thinks exists between its own foreign policy and European foreign policy, and that particularly I think French presidents sometimes adhere to, which is that if you reverse the logic, I think Europeans also need to understand that there is actually a diversity of opinions in this within France. And I'll take the take the example of PESCO again, because it's quite, I think, illuminating. A few years ago, we did a sort of very modest sociology of permanent structured cooperation, which is which is a way for Europeans to cooperate more in defense without being held back by some of the European member states which are less willing to cooperate. And actually, what's really interesting, if you do a sort of if you look at the sort of administrative mechanics within the French state itself, is that there are people, there are civil servants who have this very vertical view of how France should go about its pushing foreign policy within the European context, which is usually the sort of European foreign policy is not necessarily an end in itself, but is more of a means to further French interests and French power. And you have other constituencies, stakeholders within French administrations, which have a better and perhaps finer understanding of how EU decision-making works, how EU consensus-making works, and essentially who just have a better understanding of the EU. So you would think, for example, the Ministry of the Armed Forces has a bit more of a kind of unilateral view in which it seeks to further French interests independently of European interests, and both interests are not necessarily intertwined, and that the Foreign Ministry has a better sense of how intertwined these two interests actually are. And then the General Staff and the Armament Agency would have their own views of how to ensure French sovereignty. And actually, if you kind of if you kind of look into the can of worms that is French administration, you will actually find that within these French administrations, you have these two camps which are actually set out both in the Ministry of the Armed Forces, in the Foreign Ministry, even in the French delegation for armament. The French General Staff is a bit different because they have a more operational worldview, and they tend to integrate the European dimension a tiny bit less. But so what's interesting is if you reverse the gaze, actually, not all French administrations have a very vertical view of how European foreign policy should work.
Olivier, you should conclude quickly now.
So it's essentially about these kind of two lenses. I think if you view Europe from Paris, it's important to figure out that France cannot simply assume an identity between French foreign policy and European foreign policy, which seemed to be self-evident, but actually, if anything, recent events, including the example that Olivier took precedingly, show that not all French foreign policy circles understand this. And I think symmetrically and conversely, if you reverse the lens, not all Europeans should assume that France, including in its highest administrative circles, has a Franco-French view of European foreign policy. Actually, the lines are set in a much more complex way and run down all the different administrations which are involved in the definition of French foreign policy and how France defines and pushes its interests in European foreign policy.
Thank you very much for this illuminating view on the French mindset. One should say it in the plural of the EU. And now, Pauline, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
I see you.
Great to be back in Oxford, although remotely, unfortunately. I hope to be there in real at some point. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So I want to talk about the Franco-British bilateral relationship and account for the dire state of these relations in the past few years now, or at least until a couple of weeks ago, because things might be moving very quickly on that front. But it looks as if what had been hitherto a very strong relationship especially in the fields of defense that we've just been talking about, has almost completely collapsed since the Brexit referendum. Again, at least until the last few weeks, where the tragedy in Ukraine seems to have stopped this downward trend, but it's maybe too early to say. Anyway, I'd like to try to understand what happened first, and then try to explain it and see how we can go forward from where we are now. So a very short summary of the different episodes in this deteriorating relations in this bilateral crisis. If you remember, shortly after the 2016 referendum, in the early stages of the negotiations on Brexit itself, and for a couple of years at least, Macron was being portrayed, especially in the British media, but elsewhere as well, as the bad cop in the negotiation, the particularly hard partner who was making life very difficult for the British. That was coming from the fact that he was trying to draw a clear line between what it was to be a member of the EU and what it was to be outside. And therefore, the UK had to be shown that it couldn't have the advantages of being in and out at the same time. Then there was a second stage, was the fact later, so after Theresa May disappeared from the scene and when Johnson became Prime Minister, the French were disappointed that Johnson went for a very hard, even harder sort of Brexit than Theresa May had wanted. And the fact that he refused to institutionalize any sort of cooperation with the EU in the foreign policy and defense policy fields was difficult to understand, I think, for the French government. Then, when the trade and cooperation agreement was negotiated, and since then, to some extent, or at least in the months that followed, there was this running dispute about fisheries and access for French fishing boats to the channel that you remember. Then another episode was the highly politicized dispute over the small boats in the channel and the migrants question, which has sort of come back in the last few days around the Ukrainian refugees, but which started long before that. Another episode was the symbolic rift over the AUKUS agreement between Britain, the US, and Australia last summer, which was maybe not talked about that much in the UK, but which was a major issue for the French, in the French press and in French political debate in general, when Australia reneged on a contract with France to buy submarines and turned instead to the US and to a lesser extent to the UK for a strategic partnership then. And even later, even during the pandemic crisis, there was a flare-up about vaccines when Macron criticized, quite foolishly, I think, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which led to another crisis this time in the British media and tabloid press. So we have a number of episodes which have led to an unprecedented, at least in the last few decades, state in the bilateral relations where there's hardly any dialogue between the governments, and whenever there is, it is very negative. It is very negative in the media as well. So why has there been such a deterioration in the relationship? Some of it, I would argue, was probably inevitable. Following the shock that the Brexit referendum represented for the EU in general, and including France, it was bound to create tensions between the two neighbors, especially, of course, with the end of free circulation between the two countries. Some of it was also linked to what I referred to earlier, Johnson's choice of a very hard Brexit, which included not just leaving the single market, the customs union, but also, as we are all painfully aware, leaving the Erasmus and Horizon Europe programs, and not having any sort of cooperation on foreign policy. But a lot of it also has to do, as often, with domestic politics. In the UK, the Brexit project, what I would call the Brexit project, requires, like any other populist project, an enemy, another responsible for anything that goes wrong. And blaming France is always a very useful tool and a useful rallying point, especially when you have a party, the Conservative Party in power, which is divided about a lot of things: economic policy, taxation policy, COVID constraints, zero emissions policy, etc. Blaming France is a convenience. And on the French side, there is also domestic politics, of course, with a presidential election coming up in exactly a month today. And Europe being, if you remember, and that was referred to earlier, one of the main dividing lines between Macron and his opponents. So talking about Brexit, making sure that Britain does not have a good deal was also part of that strategy. I argued in an article that I wrote with Helen Drake recently that beyond these short-term reasons, and maybe more ominously, these tensions also suggest that there is something less stable and less permanent in the Franco-British relationship than in other more established, more institutionalized bilaterals, such as the Franco-German relationship, of course, but also the special relationship between the UK and the US. In comparison, the Franco-British one appears to be relatively shallow, in spite of the obvious similarities in size and position and interests, and in spite, of course, of the depth in economic and social links between the two countries. We noted in our article how easily stereotypes about each other appear or re-emerge easily in the media, but also in politicians' statements on both sides of the channel. So where does that leave France and the UK now? We argued that there was a really fundamental need to re-engage and rebuild trust and cooperation between France and Britain at all levels: political, official level, and also social levels, probably. It seemed to us, and it was probably true until 2 weeks ago, that it would be probably difficult to achieve until the next election in France, but also for as long as a number of issues were not solved at the EU level between London and Brussels, and in particular, of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, which remains and festers, is really a big challenge for not just the UK-EU relation, but also for the bilateral relation. The fact that David Frost resigned a few months ago might be helpful, but I would suggest that for as long as Johnson is British Prime Minister and uses the bilateral and the difficult relationship with France as a tool in his own political scene, that might be difficult. On the other hand, and I'll finish with that, the war in Ukraine gives the two countries a tragic opportunity to do exactly that, re-engage, especially, of course, on the diplomatic front. It certainly reminds both governments of how close their interests actually are. And it looks as if diplomatic and intelligence cooperation has improved in the last few weeks, with in particular the fact that Liz Truss was invited to Brussels for the first time to take part in the foreign, well, at least to attend the Foreign Affairs Council. it is, of course, a pity that it took a war in Europe to remind actors on both sides of the channel of how much they share, but it's at least one small positive side effect of the awful situation that we're in, that France and Britain might at least begin to talk to each other again. But of course, there's a lot more that will need to be done and rebuilt, I think, in the coming months and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for this retrospective and the perspective that you present us for the future of the British-French relationships. I allow me of my role of chairing this panel to raise two questions. The first one would be to both Olivier and Alienor. To some extent, there was a tension between your two narratives. Alienor stressing the evolution between the De Gaulle-Mitterrand perspective and the Macron perspective, and Olivier insisting on the persistence of the intergovernmental perspective in Macron. I don't say it is opposite, but could you explain how you can put these two narratives together? And the second question is to Pauline, and perhaps you could respond first, Pauline. You, at the end of your speech, you say that due to the war, France and England will perhaps, probably, hopefully realize that they have deep common interests or similar interests. But couldn't we have a more cynical perspective? Previously, you said that for internal politics, it's good to have the enemy, and in Britain, it's good to say that French are impossible and vice versa. No, we both have a villain, Putin. And it's perhaps not for the common interests, but more for both internal politics, that because there is a common enemy or a more powerful, more horrible enemy, that France and England will join, or at least will reduce their tension.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely a possibility. In a way, I would say the most important reason to work together is definitely to face the present common enemy and Putin. Anything that takes politicians off the eyes of blaming each other within the EU or blaming your neighbor is good. It's, as I said, it's a shame that it takes such a serious crisis and the war to reach that point. But at least we can be hopeful that it will work. I mean, the common enemy has always been a good binding element in the history of Europe, so that wouldn't be anything new from that point of view, but it's still regrettable.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, so in the meanwhile, we could raise questions, either the better way through a Q&A or through WeChat. I've noticed that there is a question in the chat to Olivier Costa that I will read afterwards. But perhaps first, to how compatible are your two narratives?
Yes, Olivier, is it okay if I start? Okay, great. Yes, thank you, Yves, for this question. I don't think our takes are that much different and incompatible, because I think I totally agree with Olivier that the intergovernmentalism method is still very prominent in Macron's presidency. Maybe the difference would be that if we go back and we compare with De Gaulle and Pompidou, the relationship to the volonté générale, I think, is very different. And also regarding the superiority of politics compared to law and economy. I think that in the new Macron presidency, the notion of a normative Europe is much more important than it used to be in both De Gaulle and Mitterrand era. So I don't think it's the way to govern, but much more in the idea, the relation to politics. I would say it's a different way to understand things. And in this sense, it's much more cosmopolitical and normative Europe than it used to be. And in this sense, it's maybe less Rousseauist than a bit more Kantian, not still a very strong Kantian Europe, I think, but a bit more. It would be my...
Olivier?
Yeah, I agree. There is no opposition between our two analyses. What I would say is that De Gaulle really had a problem with the community method. He was upset by the community method, and he could not just get rid of it because the treaty was signed just before he came back to power. But he didn't like the community method. He didn't like the qualified majority voting perspective for any sort of topic. I would say that Macron has no problem with that, but he believes strongly that leadership can only come from the European Council, and he believes maybe in a sort of layered governance, taking the high and low politics thing, considering that low politics can be managed by the community method, and then we can even expect some federal developments for those policies. But when it comes to high politics, fiscality, defense, security, etc., there is a need for intergovernmental legitimation. And when I listen to Macron, I have the feeling that he has been reading our colleagues who theorize new intergovernmentalist people like Dermot Hudson, Uwe Putter, who are not considering that European integration should not be integrated or whatever, but who are very skeptical about the possibility to have an integrated approach of policies that are close to sovereignty.
Thank you, Olivier. Perhaps you can keep the floor, because one question was for you. Do you think that the appointment of Charles Michel obeys to a same and even more French logic, chosen by Macron and others, appointed because he resists nationally against a nationalist who didn't want to sign the Marrakesh Agreement on migration? So Michel is useful against the anti-migration and erasable at will behind Macron and the letter when to be the president of Europe.
Yeah, that's true. So we must start by saying that the appointment of the President of the European Council is by definition an intergovernmental process. There is no need here to involve the public opinion, to involve the European Parliament or the European election. So here there is no distortion of the procedure like it was for the appointment of Ursula von der Leyen, but it's true that it's a very extreme intergovernmental approach of the thing. Remember that Charles Michel was himself a member of the European Council, so in a way they have been deliberating on the application of one guy who was in the room, which sounds a bit strange and super intergovernmental. He was very much pushed as Emmanuel Macron as a member of the Liberal Party. He was also selected because good at finding a consensus. If you were able to stay prime minister, he was in that very complex political situation. You are certainly good at finding some agreement and consensus in the European Council. Remember that everybody was predicting that he would not stay 2 months as a prime minister, and he was able to do that several years. Also, let's say the truth, Michel has not that much charisma and leadership, which is excellent in an intergovernmental view, because no one wants I don't know, someone like Angela Merkel, or I don't know who else as a president of the European Council that would maybe claim some leadership. Also, Michel has been advocating for a very intergovernmental approach of external affairs. The Sofagate, in my view, is not a mistake. It was just a way for Michel to recall Ursula von der Leyen, when we are dealing with international affairs, you are second, I come first. even if the treaties are not very clear about that. And finally, it's true, it has been said in the question that Michel was really ready to leave his seat, not to Ursula von der Leyen, that's for true, but to Macron, yes. And Michel has been pretty absent from the scene in the 2 last weeks with the Ukrainian crisis, leaving all the room to Macron and in fact to von der Leyen as well.
Thank you. I don't see any new question, but previously there was one question which related to Calypso's speech, but relates also to the French presidency. And Calypso, you could perhaps answer it. Can the Conference on the Future of Europe be closed by the set date, or can we expect, given the circumstances, that it will need to be extended or eventually will become a platform for a continuous discussion on the future of the EU? What is the position of France?
Calypso, you can go on this one, maybe.
Is that question? I didn't see it. I can't see it in the chat, but in any case.
It is in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a big decision for France to, but as I was saying earlier, with the changed circumstances, there will be an outcry for transforming this, what was supposed to be a one-year exercise, into a longer story that revisits some of the EU's competences. And I mean, the conversation we were just now having, or Olivier and Alienor were having on intergovernmentalism, you know, speaks to this, because of course there will be resistance both to greater competences to the European Parliament. There will be calls, but also QMV. It's going to be very, very interesting to see, because that's one of the demands that came from the citizens, but not very strongly, but it's certainly a big, big position of the European Parliament. And when I talked with the citizens as a, you know, consulted expert, I was very careful to outline the two sides to this issue, because yes, there will be a push for saying, look, even in foreign policy, efficient decision or rule of law, we can't have one country veto a decision. All of this will come back to the fore. But at the same time, in this kind of era of solidarity, and we're all in it together, one of the points that hasn't been raised, perhaps forcefully enough, is the question of, you know, all the other countries, not France and Germany or Poland, but the small and medium-sized countries, those that Elie speaks about, but also in the South. I mean, Europe is not just the Franco-German axis. And indeed, if we, you know, part of, I think, the Kantian Europe that Alienor was talking about is a Kant who worries about interstate domination. That's why he never went for the dominion, or maybe early in his life, but in his main perpetual peace is based on national autonomy. Because in fact, he feared that small countries would be bullied by big countries. So in a way, that's where Rousseau and Kant overlap too. And where we should be in the not for nothing, because the stability of the system has always been in the survival and thriving of smaller countries, which is why even, you know, a classic federal approach wouldn't really work very well in the EU, even though, of course, federations give some space to small states, but not enough. And so I thought it would be important in our conversation, and including that connects to Pauline's very important presentation on Franco-British, because one of the things that has happened is, of course, Britain was a good friend of Eastern Europeans, and to this day, it's stationing more troops than Western EU countries. And it's been really interesting to watch. And I also had this question also for Pauline, you know, how you think that Britain is managing this kind of neo-bilateralism in a post-Brexit era now, that you spoke about Franco-British, but in fact, there's always been a competition between France and Britain in who's the closest to Eastern Europe or Southern Europe or whatever, you know, how is that panning out, and including in the new context?
Alienor has also a question to Pauline, so perhaps you can raise the question and Pauline then could answer to both.
Yes, my question will be very brief, Pauline. I was wondering if there is, as it is the case in France or in Germany, if there is an underlying ideology about sovereignty in the English classical tradition that would explain partly the position of the UK in the European Union today. And I'm wondering that especially because when I studied the first Italian federalists, they were promoting and defending the Anglo-Saxon federalism as opposed to the French federalism. So I was wondering if there is still a way of thinking of this relationship between federalism and sovereignty, which would be specifically British or Anglo-Saxon, at least. Thank you.
Right. So maybe first a short answer to Calypso. I'm not sure the present government is actually doing anything about bilateral relationships in the EU. You were mentioning Eastern European countries. My feeling is of a very inward-looking country at the moment. Well, not anymore, obviously, in the last couple of weeks. I keep repeating this. I mean, things have changed so much. But until then, there didn't seem to be much thinking within the Foreign Office or elsewhere about the future type of relations with the EU as a whole or with individual EU countries. When you look at the strategic review, there was almost nothing, and on purpose, of course, about cooperation with Europe. It was all about global Britain, about the new links that were going to be created in the Indo-Pacific, about the special relationship with the US, and there was almost nothing. There was a little bit on France and on Germany, but almost nothing on the EU. And that was I would argue, an ideological stance. It was something willingly done in order to make a point. But again, this is probably going to change a lot now, thanks to, if I may say, the war in Ukraine. So that's what I would say at this point. About sovereignty and federalism in the British tradition, I mean, the question of sovereignty has been central to the whole debate about European integration in the UK for decades. And it's not just Brexit, obviously, it goes back to the 50s. Federalism is much less British, if I may say, in the British intellectual tradition than it is in the US, obviously. And I don't think the word Anglo-Saxon here is really very meaningful because the traditions are extremely different. There is very little debate about federalism in the UK, apart from coming from the Liberals. But as you know, they only represent a small, if old, tradition in British political life. So I'm not sure federalism, and still today, it is very important, apart from a few academics here and there who are still talking about that, and the European movement in the UK, which is still talking about that. And there is a bit of a debate, but which is more internal around the question of Scotland and also and how to accommodate the different nations in the UK, but not really at the European level. And I don't think it's ever been very present. It did exist, but it was really marginal, I would argue.
Olivier de France.
Thanks. Do you mind if I answer your first question? I wasn't quite sure which Olivier you were referring to, but I just wanted to add another element, which is sometimes a bit surprisingly underestimated, I think, outside of France. So on this question of the intergovernmentalism of Macron and the thread that links him to de Gaulle, I think there's an obvious underlying thread, which is the nuclear deterrent. The nuclear deterrent is actually something that is not just that has an influence outside of the field of nuclear deterrence itself. Actually, it has a lot of, it's intertwined both with the constitutional setup of France, of the Fifth Republic. It's intertwined with how conventional warfare is undertaken, and I also think it's intertwined with how the political setup of France is set up, and it explains to a certain extent some of the schizophrenia, really the French schizophrenia between this kind of the intergovernmental and the community, the European community approach. If you actually look at what the nuclear deterrent entails, it basically is linked to a very kind of executive and vertical conception of power. When nuclear doctrine is decided, when the key points are decided, the French defense minister is not even in the room. Macron is a leader who is directly elected by the French people in order to represent their interests, and he is the one who defines the vital interests of the country. There's no electoral college like in the US. It's not the party who nominates the prime minister like in the UK. So there's this very intimate link between the president and I suppose the French people, the volonté générale. And I think that's also a link between Emmanuel Macron and Charles de Gaulle. And if you actually look at some of the policies that have come out of Macron's presidency on Europe, you will see that in a way, the genealogy of some of these policies is actually a way of squaring the circle between this very vertical conception of power and the more horizontal instincts of Macron in European terms. So a kind of conjunction between his vertical conception of power and his European normative instincts. For example, the European Intervention Initiative, which a lot of European allies were puzzled about, is actually a way of squaring the circle between these two different camps within the French administration. And if you look at within the French administration how the dividing lines actually lie, you will realize that a lot of the people who have a kind of French nationalist view first, of which Europe is just a sort of function which uses Europe as a function of European power, as a means to European power, are often the bits of the administration which are most linked with the French nuclear deterrent or with the French general staff. It's what is called in France affaires stratégiques. And alongside that, you have senior civil servants who understand the way the EU works, and who understand that French and European interests are more intertwined. And a lot of these policies are actually a sort of hybrid between the vertical French power and the sort of horizontal vision that Macron has tried to implement during his own presidency.
Elie, do you want to jump into discussion?
You said my name?
No, Elie.
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, I have just a reflection on the French perception, and we've talked a lot. I mean, there are two things that I find very striking, very interesting discussion. Is the first one, it seemed that Eastern Europeans have not had the chance to contribute to policymaking in the EU. So we talk about leadership and we continue talking about the Franco-German motto of European integration. We talk about the balance and how, what is the vision of France and how, to what extent France and Germany can accommodate and shape the future vision. And I was wondering whether you think that there might be now a shift to accommodate perhaps a broader or deeper understanding of some of the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, or whether there will be, because we talk a lot after Brexit as well, that UK was kind of the balancing country, bringing France and Germany together. Now, after the German election, there is an understanding that France and Germany are on the same page. And I was wondering whose vision for the future of European integration do you think that will be, I don't know, most successful, or to what extent can other countries shape France? Because Emmanuel Macron has been the one providing ideas about the future of Europe and the Sorbonne speech. And basically, to what extent you think that other countries can now compete with France for their vision for what European integration should be like? Or which countries do you think should shape France's vision of what European integration should be like, or contribute to the Franco-German model of European integration?
Who answers this? Nobody? Too difficult a question?
I'm really sorry, dear colleagues, but I have another conference starting at 6. This is our life in those times. So I will leave now, and thank you very, very much for the great conversation. See you soon.
Thank you. Yes. In any case, I think that we should conclude soon our discussion. So Samuel was, but I don't see him anymore suddenly.
He also sent his apologies because he has to go to another event at 5 o'clock. And maybe that is a sign to all of us that it has been a stimulating event, no doubt. And we're losing panelists. Maybe there's a convention that 5 o'clock is a break, tea or whatever, rather than 5:15. So, but if Yves thinks we can fill the next 15 minutes, then I'm very happy to hand it over.
Yes, I think that we could end it. Perhaps Alienor wants to add something to conclude. I don't know.
No, just to thank once again everybody to be here. It was a very interesting and very very useful exchange, I think. So thank you to all of you, and I hope we will have the opportunity to restart this discussion again. So
and perhaps
thank you to the organizer also.
And perhaps Pascal Marty, the director of the Maison Française, wants to give us.
Yes, thank you, Yves, and well, my deepest apologies for not having been able to attending the World Conference, the World Workshop. But yes, thank you so much to the speakers, the organizers, the ESC, Hartmut, and your very efficient team, the MFO team, Yves, Samuel, who is at the MFO during this time, and Anne-Sophie. So when we thought about this event, we focused on the French presidency of the EU, and at least myself, I had in mind a workshop focused more on classical EU studies topics like governance, cohesion, democratic processes, decision-making, climate change mitigation. But the war in Ukraine changed completely the intellectual landscape, and I'm very happy we were able to gather speakers, representatives of the expertise coming from the research in social sciences and political science. I think that particularly in times of crisis, even more than in normal times, the public sphere is occupied by different and sometimes competing forms of expertise, from journalists, politicians, high-level civil servants or former high-level civil servants, essayists. And well, just to say one word, I'm very happy we had the opportunity to exchange ideas and build together at least embryos of answers to the very difficult questions of the time. So thank you very much to every one of you.